Hey there, vinyl community. This is kind of like my last video. This one's kind of off the cuff. A topic that I wanted to talk about a little bit. I don't even know if I'll release this one because it's a little bit of a different kind of topic, but I just thought it was kind of an interesting area. I was out the other day doing a little hunting, and came across this little 10 inch. Uh, Nice handy little 10 inch. Looks like it's released like a promo piece from like the Scandinavian part of Europe that it was released into. Came out like around 1980, 81. And it's not rare or anything. I've never seen it before. But it contains a lot of kind of like, mostly kind of what you'd think of as like new wave, um, power pop, new wave, post punk kind of bands, right from that era. That I always think of that time, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. That time frame, that 19, kind of on the far end in the 70s, like 78, 79, 80, 81, you know, 82 maybe, but really it's really kind of the magic years were kind of 70, kind of 78, 79, 80 were really kind of just for me anyway, kind of a classic era in American commercial rock radio. And that's kind of the area I wanted to talk to. When I was a young kid, growing up in suburban Detroit and listening to the radio, all the time. Um, that was a big part of it. I was young, but young enough that I was starting to get interested in music and collecting records and heading in that area, um, and I was very aware of radio. And back then, local radio stations they were very locally orientated. So if you turned on in one of the big station here in big rock radio station here in Detroit was WRIF, and there were some rivals. There were competing rivals, and but they always had made a real effort to be kind of in the clubs. So on a Friday night, even though I was only uh, you know 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 years old or whatever, you could tune in and you could hear a band play live, and they would be hosting the event, and you'd hear local bands that we would have in the air, like Bittersweet Alley, or I should have brought some of those records down so I could show them off to you guys. And but anyway, and so there was a local kind of a feel, and so the stations made an effort to really do that, something that we don't see anymore. And so how do these two things kind of collaborate? Well, there was this time, in the late '70s. I think after '77, you know, the punk movement happened primarily in Europe and in the UK, and of course in New York and areas, but it didn't really come into the heartland, into the Midwest until later. But there was these few years, this 78, 79, 80, 81, when it looked as if American rock radio was really going to kind of open up, and because before that, and I even knew this as a kid, like the playlists were really tight. To get played on, you had to be, the bands that got played all the time were like the Eagles and Kansas and those kind of rock radio had turned into kind of AOR, and it had this, they had this tag of the corporate, and there was a kind of corporate sound that kind of went along with all that. These bands definitely had a more, the production techniques and all the rough edges were smoothed out, and the bands had long hair, but then they had like a suit jacket on, and they were, you know, and a lot of the like rawness of what what rock music was kind of got left behind. But there seemed to be this kind of opening that was kind of happening, and I remember being, you'd be being a kid, and suddenly you would hear the typical kind of like the Led Zeppelin song or whatever, and then all of a sudden you would hear like Nick Lowe, which maybe that doesn't seem strange today to say it, but those Nick Lowe, and I grabbed a few 7 inches to kind of show you what I mean. Kind of this era, I think the Elvis, those early Elvis singles. So you started to hear Elvis Costello getting played on, Midwestern mainstream radio, and this is XTC. This Making Plans for Nigel. I think this came out in '79. So, and this kind of Starry Eyes kind of exemplifies perfectly. It's that cross between power pop and new wave and punk, kind of all intersecting, with this really catchy single, which came out in '78. So, this early Ramones, so this is early, this is '77. Ramones were early, but they were kind of part of that sound too, that was starting to break into mainstream commercial radio, in the States. And I know there are different setups in Europe and stuff, so a lot of this probably won't make as much sense, other than to kind of maybe make you aware of something that like almost happened, but it didn't. And so it was almost as if this kind of revolution was beginning to happen in American radio. It had kind of stagnated into the mid to late '70s. Rock music had kind of stagnated and gotten very corporate, and it looked as if for a little while, there were going to be all these new bands, Talking Heads and the whole the whole New York scene. I just grabbed a bunch of so the Dolls, which were earlier, obviously, but and you probably were never going to hear Suicide, but Richard Hell and Television, and so all of this kind of stuff. Another band that kind of exemplifies that cross section that you don't hear too much about was 2020. They were kind of I compare them to maybe the Cars, very commercial sounding, but had that new wave sound. Another one would be, I always think of for a more classic rock orientated, like Alice Cooper, his album, that single, We're All Clones, kind of exemplifies that changing sound that was starting to, and that song, that Clone song, got a lot of play in, it sounded a lot like, I have the record right here, actually. I pulled a bunch of new wave stuff out, but that Alice Cooper track I always thought sounded a lot like Gary Newman. And so all of a sudden, you're starting to hear all these track. Cars was the single from this that just got a ton of radio play mixed in, and there was a contrast. You saw this contrast between these classic rock era and these corporate rock era stuff, and this new music that was starting to infiltrate the playlists, and because before that the playlists were just really tight, and then right around 1981, 82, so it looked like this revolution was happening inside the radio or the music industry, and then it stopped. And you can see, I could, as a young listener, tell that something happened, and suddenly the playlists got real tight again. And suddenly, if you weren't kind of a former Black Sabbath vocalist, or a former guitar player for Boston, you weren't going to get on there. And fortunately, another thing that happened was MTV started to happen in a few years coming up, and would open things up on a national level a little bit more. So we did hear from some of these acts again, but a lot of them just kind of got lost in the mix, and the playlist tightened up, and a lot of it had to do with legislation that was passed in Washington before. Local stations, and it was always seen as a need to have kind of community environments, and so you wanted to have local stations that catered to their particular audience, and it kind of forced radio stations and print media too to be very locally oriented, cover those local news stories, cover the local band, have a couple hours on the radio a week that local bands could come on and have an interview or get played, and that all it all vanished. And legislation was passed in Washington that made it so that multinational corporations could come in and buy up local media. And this was, at the time, of course, they sold it as this great thing that was going to happen, and it was actually going to make media flourish. And you figure before 1980, there were literally thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of local medias that were, privately owned. Somebody who owned a little radio station, or someone who owned a little newspaper, and you saw it was everywhere. And you still see some of that, but not much. And today, I think there's like 8 or 9 media companies that own everything. These huge corporations that just own, so that local station that you're listening to, they may say in their call letters, it may say, they're from New York or from Boston or from Detroit or Chicago or wherever, but they're owned by a larger corporation, and they set the playlist, and it's not about public service anymore at all. It's just about, show me the money. And we lost something. I think we lost something really valuable when that happened. We lost control of the media in a way that made it so we put this really, really important outlet for people in the hands of just a few people. And just a huge error, and one that I don't even, trying to go back and almost seems like an impossibility. But maybe not. Maybe it's something people should consider again, or at least making it so there can be more local media outlets for music, for more diverse music, and also for a voice, so that local people have a voice. Anyway, it was this little 10-inch that got me thinking about all that. And the reason is because it just had a really cool playlist that I just never really pulls together a bunch of those tracks. It's a little double 10-inch. I'm sorry if this is kind of like off the beaten track a little bit, but it's how I relate to music a lot, is through community and through growing up and seeing those changes happen. Even, like I say, even at a young age, even at that young age of 10 or 12 years old or whatever, and I sensed that something, like I say, you started to hear bands getting played. And I'll read some of these playlists so you get an idea of of the bands that I'm kind of talking about. Like, it starts off right away with Eddie and the Hot Rods, Do Anything You Want to Do, Statue of Liberty by XTC, Television Screens by the Radiators from Space. A track that I remember getting played quite a bit in the Detroit area was the Greg Kinn Band, and they did a cover of Bruce Springsteen's "For You," and I always liked that track. It was a track I liked as a young kid. Saints and Sinner by Johnny and the Self-Abusers. If I'm not mistaken, Johnny and the Self-Abusers is Simple Minds. Like an early version of Simple Minds. Kidnapper by Blondie. And I'll quickly go through a few more of these. Love and Cup by Earthquake. The Radio Stars. That was a band that I remember getting some local play. Again, kind of a new wave power pop band. The track is Nervous Wreck. Ultravox. Rockwork. I Think We're Alone Now. Dancing the Night Away by The Motors. Another one of those kind of, later they would have just called it like alternative rock, but it was kind of that mix of power pop, for lack of a better term, and then kind of with a little punk edge to it, and this just got a left field. They throw on here White Line Fever by Motorhead. Your Generation by Generation X. There's a band here. I won't even say their name because they're just, I won't even say the name. Roadrunner by Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers, and they ended up with Oh Bondage Up Yours by the X-Ray Specs. So I don't think you can see the track listing. I'm sure you can, but if you like that era of music, that end of the '70s, early '80s. Where there was just so much happening in music. And you think about it on even on a larger spectrum, that disco was also happening, and hip hop was happening, and so what a amazing little period of time. That's why I always found the CBGB scene so interesting in New York. That New York was really culturally at the heart of everything at that moment, because disco and punk and and hip hop were all kind of happening within a few miles of each other. You know, when you think about it. Anyway, keep an eye out for it. Catch a Wave, and then just kind of the background of why that little music revolution didn't happen, and the playlist went back to be. And they never really opened up again. MTV kind of forced some opening, because they just wanted videos, and so some bands were able to slip through the cracks because they had videos out, and so we heard from bands that we probably would have never heard from had it not been that opportunity that MTV presented to them. But and I think sometimes about the way radio could have been different, and that if that music revolution had been allowed to happen, and if the older bands were allowed to, you know, hey, their fans are still going to love them, and that's all good and great and everything. But if radio was really had been able to cater to a young audience, and that each generation could have come up and had their generations of music, which is how I always thought it should be. You know, kind of out with the old and in with the new. You know, you have your time, and then a generation comes in, and their revolution overturns your revolution. And anyway, just a few rambling thoughts about music in a interesting period of time that I think we made some historic mistakes legislatively, and that our rush to make everything corporatized, and that the answer was always about the bottom line, and making bottom line for corporations to make them wealthier, that we lost something that people and people had a sense of community, and we lost some of that because our media just became distracted by nationwide events. Anyway, I won't go on anymore. Thanks for listening to me, and if you see this little 10-inch, I had never seen it before. Keep an eye out for it, and I think it's pretty cool. It sounds great too. So, thanks, and we'll see you next time.